Good afternoon. Welcome back. Sean here, Mountains Garage. I've made a few videos in the past about LS swap, torque converter spacing. Today's video is going to talk about that as well as a few other things you can do to help prevent wiping out your thrust bearing on an LS that's bolted ahead of a Turbo 400. And it no doubt applies to other transmissions, but in this case, we're talking an LS style engine and a Turbo 400. It's been well talked about. I've done it as well. You can drill and tap the front pump on a Turbo 400 and restrict the converter charge pressure feed. Typically, you take what was like a 1/4 inch hole, slightly bigger, restrict it down to 1/8 inch or whatever your flavor is. Some people go up or down. There are also restricted a jet, if you will. They run a different line off that, and they actually monitor the converter charge pressure and control it with like a jet you'd see in a carburetor that's fixed all the time. Dump valves also momentarily do take the converter charge pressure and dump it in the pan, which also helps the problem with the thrust bearing. If you Google LS thrust bearing modifications, you can cut a chamfer that feeds more oil to the thrust bearing surface itself. That certainly helps and is totally free and only takes a few minutes. So look that up and accomplish all these things. You might as well do as many things as you possibly can to mitigate the problem. But personally, I believe the majority of the trouble comes from the adapter that is used when you take a legacy spacing torque converter, a torque converter built for a small or big block Chevy, and you want to use it behind your LS engine. With only two exceptions, the LS engine crankshaft is 0.400 shorter than the traditional legacy Chevrolet. There are long crank, is what they're called, 6 liters. Typically those are the ones in 99 and 2000 with the cast iron heads. They also had the 0.400 longer crank. And they made a 4.8 long crank as well. So the crankshaft is this much longer, 0.400. If you have one of those, you can run the flat flex plate that came with a 4L80. I've been over this a dozen times, so please go back and reference my videos. But today, we're taking a legacy spacing torque converter. Doing away with these, I'm actually spacing this converter for a friend of mine who's gone through countless engines in his twin turbo LS powered F100. And he's looking for answers, and I'm going to weld on a 0.400 spacer on the hub after I check to make sure that that is correct for his application, because all hubs on all converters aren't the same. There's a little bit of leeway there, so I'm going to show you how I'm going to check it. And then I'm going to simply weld this in the middle onto his converter. It's not even a permanent mod. You could take it back off down the road. Now, sidebar, if you are a mover and a shaker in the aftermarket parts world, why aren't these commercially available? Take these things and throw them in the trash and just sell a little weld-on converter. Most people have the ability to weld in that small hole. And this little adapter that I loathe so much actually becomes your jig to hold it still while you weld on your old converter, and then you can do with that what you will. Paperweight, if you will. So the problem with these, I feel, is that register right there. The torque converter runs right into that. So if there is forward movement caused by converter charge pressure or the transmission pushing the flex plate and converter forward, it stops there, and the next step on the train, the next car in line, is your thrust bearing. It's pushing on it all the time. These, I think the converter itself will physically crash into it. It's a better option, but for instance, in one of my videos, I was unable to use this as well due to the way my converter was made. The hub wasn't completely flat. It only had a little ring at the end, and then it stepped down, and that would drop below this. creating a whole nother list of problems. In both the scenarios, I'm talking about my friend's F100 and my Nova are both the dished flex plate variety, where both of these are on the transmission side of the flex plate. If you want to run the flat flex plate, I would still put this between the crank and the flex plate because the flex plate needs to be this much closer to the transmission. And then I would still weld this on the hub of my converter and check my spacing that way. But today's exercise, we're talking about the dished flex plate, which is way more popular because they're on everything if you're converting a stock one. And in my case, for my Nova, it was about $100 cheaper than the flat version in the SFI variety. And I'm going to give my buddy some grief here when he picks up his converter because he's not running an SFI flex plate. If you buy that without any spacer, it's only like 80 bucks. It's money well spent. So let's check how this works out with his old converter on the back of an engine I got sitting over here on a stand. I'm not sure how this camera angle is going to work out, but we'll give it a try. So I've Scotch-Brighted the end of my crankshaft so everything works really smooth. I'm just going to set my homemade adapter, and I'll give you the dimensions of this in a minute. I'm just going to set it at the end of the crank, stick it out a little more, and I'm going to hold the torque converter up against the pads. Now, if you've run a dish flex plate with a legacy style converter, the converter needs to come out of the front pump at 1/8 to 3/16 forward. The gap you have is probably a 1/4 inch or more with this combination of parts. So you're probably going to need an 1/8 inch spacer on each of the torque converter bolts. So that's not part of today's equation. But what I want to accomplish, when I put the converter up to the flex plate, I want the pads to be able to touch the flex plate. With all the adapters I showed you in the bench, you cannot accomplish this. It's actually going to be run with a spacer, so I'm going to have that much more room in my end of my crankshaft. But I'll show you when I do this how much headspace I still have ahead of this. So I'm going to try to do this without knocking the camera over. Okay, we're on the back of the engine right there. Right there. We pushed it in. I still have that much more. So by the time I run it back out with the spacer, it's probably going to be out of the crankshaft about that far. But I have plenty of headspace. Let's weld her on. All right, so upside down on the bench, I've cleaned this surface with a Scotch-Brite pad. I'm only going to weld the center hole. So I'm going to just fill that with weld and grind it smooth. You'll never know I did anything. I want the outside to be perfectly smooth so it can travel the full distance if it could. A nice, fun use for this adapter that we no longer have a use for. If you're really careful, it's a precision fit, but it becomes your jig. I'm going to tack that and then remove that because I don't want to get spatter on it because I want to use it next time. But it holds it in perfect alignment. Now I'm just going to MIG weld the hole. I'll actually tack it, check it in the crank one more time to make sure I'm totally happy with everything I see. And then weld it up for good. I tacked it in place, removed the adapter. Now let's go walk over to the engine and try it on the back. This is the equivalent of measure twice, cut once. I don't want to weld it all the way on there and then not be happy with the dimensions of it. So easier to check now. All right, let's try it on. The size. Again, try not to block the camera. I'm starting to go in the back of the crank now, and I have a good 3/8 or more. So by the time I'm in, I can go all the way in flush, which is great. And if I back it out 1/8, almost all of my adapter is in the back of the crank, which is what I wanted to see. So that's perfect. All right, we are welded up and ground down smooth. It almost looks factory. And just like that, we eliminated the possibility of the torque converter hub crashing into the back of the crankshaft. It could flex a 1/2 inch now, and in reality, it's never going to flex that much. It's not going to run into the adapter. It takes all the worry out of it. He may still have 99 problems with his combination, but this isn't one of them. And it was really easy to fix. Now, the dimensions on the piece that I made. The OD is 1.700 thousandths. That's the size of, what's the ID of your crankshaft? It's the OD of the hub on any converter. You can be plus or minus 1 or 2 thousandths, but I cut it right to 1.700. The ID hole in the middle is just for welding. I cut it 695 thousandths, which is what was left over after an 11/16 drill bit went through it. The bigger the hole, the easier it is to weld, but the more weld you're going to put in it. And thickness is 0.400, which is what is missing off the LS crankshaft compared to the old small and big block Chevy. In this particular converter, I could probably add 450 thousandths, but you don't need it. I mean, my whole adapter is inside the crankshaft when this is in the correct position and spaced for the pull out of the pump, which is between 1/8 and 3/16. So you bolt it up to the back of the engine with the converter shoved all the way in. You need to bring it ahead 1/8 to 3/16. That spaces the lugs on the converter and the pump gears. I've showed you that in the picture if you look at my other videos. I know for a fact with the dish flex plate, when you bolt the engine, the transmission to the back of the engine with the torque converter in it, you got like a 1/4 inch gap. And you're going to end up running probably an 1/8 inch spacer. That's not a problem with your 7/16 bolts, which is an upgraded size over the stock 3/8 or M10. A performance torque converter and flex plate take a 7/16 grade 8 bolt. So you'll need to source some 7/16 ID spacers. If you have a whole pile of washers, you can sit there with a micrometer and pick 3 that are really close. You can order exact sized spacers. They sell them both at your high performance parts warehouses have them. Places like McMaster Car, you might have to buy 50 or 100, but I should probably do that. I like buying in bulk. But this is so easy, never again will I run anything like that. I, like everybody else, have used this in the past, but it was just on a street car, not something with a trans brake and maybe a turbocharger, so you're on the trans brake a lot longer. Building boost, that's where your problem comes from. With the flat flex plate, you still need to space out the flex plate from the engine. In both cases, I've said this before, but all LS starters are the same, whether you have a dish flex plate or a flat with a spacer. If you have a flat with a spacer, I would still put a hub in the back of the converter. It does no harm. It's just going to go through here and into the back of the crank, so you can make your own measurements and see what the thickness is right for you. I haven't tried it with the 0.400. The torque converter I put in my twin turbo Nova a few months ago, my hub was extra long, so my spacer that I weld on was only 370 thousandths, because all converters aren't made the same. They're in a range, because typically they're just, on a small big block Chevy, the end of the crankshaft's pretty deep, so they're not super accurate. So you need to do a little measuring or check it like I just showed you. It's not that hard. This whole process, including shooting the video, might have taken a half an hour. This torque converter was even full of oil. Probably the more oil in it, the better for cooling while I'm welding. I mean, it's only concentrated on a small spot. He didn't bring it over with a cap on it, but I had one to stick on it, and it slowed the leak down when I had it upside down on the bench. It did leak a little bit, but that's okay. Keep the bench from rusting. I hope you got something out of it. Like, share, subscribe. As I looked this morning, I was, like one short of 1,800 subscribers. We're growing all the time at a snail's pace, but hey, it's all great. I appreciate every one of you. Thanks, and I'll catch you in a couple days. Who knows what we're going to be up to.